Welcome to our presentation on the rape of Nanking. Over the course of centuries, Japan and China have always had tension, but one of the most notable conflicts between them was the massacre of Nanking. This massacre is marked as one of the most brutal acts in history, but many do not read into the reasons as to why and how it happened, and what the ramifications were and are today. World War II set the precedence of what counted as a crime of war. This massacre, however graphic, was such an infamous event that it still plagues international relations today. The true nature and number of deaths in the massacre have been disputed and exploited for propaganda purposes by historical revisionists, apologists, and nationalists. Some even claim that the numbers of deaths have been inflated, while others have denied that any massacre ever occurred. There has been a long history of poor relations between China and Japan. Japan's long chain of invasions and war crimes in China between 1894 and 1945, as well as modern Japan's attitudes towards its past, are major issues affecting current Sino-Japanese relations. In 663 AD, the Battle of Gang took place, the first China-Japanese conflict in recorded history. Many more conflicts followed. As Japan modernized and built a strong economy and military, the smaller country grew in power. Friction between China and Japan arose from the 1870s from Japan's control over the Ryukyu Islands, rivalry for political influence in Korea, and trade issues. Japan won the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95, further increasing tensions between the two countries. The new modern Meiji establishments caused Japan to abandon its feudal system to pursue industrialization. Regardless, the Japanese maintained their historical ideologies and traditions. These traditions revolved around two main concepts, the kokutai and the kodo. The kokutai translates most closely to the national essence, and it described the uniqueness of Japan among other nations. It defined the emperor as a god descended from the gods that created Japan. In this way, the kokutai was able to unify the Japanese religion and government, which became a powerful tool to unify the citizens and soldiers. The imperialist approach that Japan exercised in World War II was mostly driven by the military with the facade of kinship to promote popularity among the Japanese citizens. Furthermore, this idea promoted nationalism among the Japanese culture, which foreshadowed its alliance with the authoritarian German state in World War II. The kodo translates to the imperial way, which describes that Japan was superior to other nations and that the Japanese race was unique and more perfect in relation to others. It stated that it was the Japanese duty to liberate nations with modern technology. This emphasizes the Japanese destiny to expand, a similar concept to manifest destiny in the colonization of North America. Japan also wanted to expand to new lands to promote more businesses, which were expanding due to the economic changes of the Meiji Restoration. The kodo was significant because it justified their attempt to expand into China, which resulted eventually in the Nanking Massacre. This idea also led Japanese people to honor the military and soldiers, believing that death in war was an honorary thing. So, why did the Japanese try to attack Nanking? Well, before the war started, the Japanese bragged that they would take over all of China in less than 3 months. However, one of the primary battles of the war took place in Shanghai, where the Chinese showed a strong military defense against the Japanese forces. Although the Chinese lost that battle, they greatly surpassed the expectations of the Japanese. Moreover, the Chinese refused to surrender. The Japanese leaders were becoming impatient with the state of the war and decided to head directly for the current capital of China, Nanking. In fear of losing the war, the Chinese defense strategically retreated to the other side of the Yangtze River, leaving untrained soldiers to protect the city against the Japanese military. Although the Chinese had a higher number of soldiers and more ammunition, they lost the battle and thus set up the conditions for the rape of Nanking to take place. Iwana Matsui was general of the Japanese army leading the troops responsible for the atrocities in Nanking. Before the attack and during the Second Sino-Japanese War, he insisted that the war with China would not end until Nanking, China's capital at the time, was under Japanese control. Matsui was continually plagued by command problems all throughout his army career, as he was an elderly general that his troops did not respect. When his troops began marching on Nanking, He ordered that a summons to surrender be dropped by airplane over the city. When they did not respond within 24 hours, he ordered the attack. Matsui was ill during the rape of Nanking, but determined to avoid the worst, he distributed a pamphlet called Essentials for Assaulting Nanking to his troops, emphasizing that Chinese civilians were not to be harmed, but saying nothing about prisoners of war. Despite the pamphlet, his unruly and disrespectful troops still killed thousands of civilians, while Matsui was ill in bed. Regarding the rapes and murders, Matsui later commented in his field diary, "The truth is that some such acts are unavoidable." During the attack, the Japanese military executed an estimated 150,000 male war prisoners, murdered an additional 50,000 male civilians, and raped at least 20,000 women and girls of all ages, many of whom were mutilated or killed in the process. The total number of dead is estimated to be somewhere between 40,000 and 200,000 people. The number of dead is disputed by some scholars and government officials. The frequent claim is that the numbers are too high, while some claim that the attack never happened at all. Was there a Chinese resistance movement in the city during the Japanese occupation? Well, there isn't much documentation to support such. This is largely because Chinese civilians were brutally murdered if they showed any kind of resistance towards the Japanese troops. Foreign civilians were the primary form of resistance as they took pictures and film of the Japanese atrocities. One notable figure doing this was missionary John McGee, chairman of the Nanking Committee of the International Red Cross Organization. In addition to his films and pictures, McGee is credited with saving the lives of over 200,000 Chinese civilians. There was also a small force of Westerners working in Nanking to keep Chinese civilians safe. One of their primary jobs was to establish and maintain the Nanking Safety Zone, where Chinese non-combatants could come to stay safe from Japanese forces. Following the departure of the Chinese government, most foreigners also decided to flee Nanking. A small number of Western businessmen and missionaries, however, chose to remain in what would become a battlefield. They were primarily American missionaries from the Episcopal, Disciples of Christ, Presbyterian, and Methodist churches. John Rabe, an elected German businessman from a Chinese corporation and also a Nazi party member, signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, which allowed for 3.4 square miles to be designated a safety zone, in which the Japanese could not carry out atrocities in exchange for the evacuation of the Chinese forces within that area. The Chinese troops were reluctant to leave the space at first, but later conceded to the Japanese agreement. The safety zone saved around 300,000 people in the Nanking Massacre, and almost all of the survivors from the massacre were those who sought shelter within that zone. Many countries overlooked the atrocities of Nanking due to the devastating events taking place in Germany. The Holocaust was becoming prominent in European newspapers, and only small headlines were given to Japan. Looking back, many historians argue that the rape of Nanking was one of the worst atrocities to take place in World War II era, either in the European or Pacific theater. Violence in war and disregard for women in battle was mostly exemplified in the Japanese war front. The raping of women in Nanking and the creation of comfort women, which was a euphemism for forced human trafficking in the Japanese war front, showcased the disregard for women and violent ideals that the Japanese had. The Nanking Massacre exemplifies the regression of war ethics among countries such as Japan and Germany. The formation of the United Nations was a direct effect of the catastrophes that took place throughout the war and the violence and barbarism that was seen in World War II. While some argue that nothing should be compared to the horrors of the Shoah, otherwise known as the Holocaust, the rape of Nanking comes closest in its brutality and disregard for human life. There are many ways in which the two atrocities can be compared. The Shoah and the rape of Nanking come in at numbers 1 and 2 respectively on the list of the greatest massacres of the 20th century. The videos of the destruction in Nanking were sent to the US and to Germany, where it may have inspired Nazis and other Shoah murderers to their cruel tasks. The horrors of Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen concentration camps may have also inspired the perpetrators. Both the rape of Nanking and the Shoah now also have deniers insisting that they did not happen. Following the rape of Nanking, both Japan and China have eventually acknowledged the occurrence of these wartime atrocities. However, there is still much debate between the countries over the horror's modern portrayal. In Japan, Initially, it was a total cover-up during the war, followed by confessions and documentations by the Japanese soldiers during the 1950s and 60s, and then minimization of the extent of the massacre during the 1970s and 80s, and an official Japanese government distortion and rewriting of history during the 1980s, and finally a total denial of the occurrence of the Nanking massacre by some government officials in 1990. While an official apology was issued by Japanese Prime Minister Tomoichi Murayama and Emperor Akihito in 1995, 50 years after the incident, denial still occurs. In May 1994, Justice Minister Shigeto Nagano called the Nanking massacre a fabrication. Takashi Kawamura, mayor of Nagoya, said in 2012 that the massacre probably never happened, and Tokyo Governor Shintaro Ishihara agreed with him. After the conclusion of the war in 1945, two separate war crime trials dealt with the perpetrators of the Nanking massacre. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East was organized in accordance with the Potsdam Declaration, with representative judges appointed by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, Douglas MacArthur. The Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal was carried out by the Kuomintang government of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek. General Matsuya Iwana and Foreign Minister Hirota Koki were tried in Tokyo by the IMTFE, and both were convicted of failure to uphold the standards of the Hague Convention in allowing the atrocities to take place in Nanjing. Both were sentenced to death by hanging on November 12, 1948. The testimony given at this trial by the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone marked the first time that the Japanese public was made aware of the atrocities that their military carried out at Nanjing. One of 13 tribunals conducted by the Republic of China after the war, the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal tried just 4 Japanese participants in the massacre, including Lieutenant General Hisao Tani of the 6th Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, and 3 other officers of lower rank, Captain Tanaka Gunkichi, Lieutenant Mukai Toshiaki, and Lieutenant Noda Tsuyoshi. These lower-ranking officers were notable for their claims to have beheaded hundreds of Chinese prisoners of war. Tani was sentenced to death by firing squad on March 10, 1947, while the others received the same sentence on January 28, 1948. Another prominent figure present in Nanjing was Prince Asaka, Lieutenant General of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force. He would normally have borne responsibility for the actions of those under his command, as was Matsui, but he was granted immunity from prosecution for his status as a member of the royal family. Of the military commanders present in Nanjing during the massacre, no one else remained alive to stand trial after the war. This was the extent of criminal punishment received by the Japanese for the rape of Nanking. To this day, relations between Japan and its former wartime enemies and subjects are strained by the legacy of the Imperial Japanese military's conduct in World War II. In particular, there exists a deep-seated distrust between China and Japan over the Nanjing massacre, also including South Korea with the issue of so-called comfort women, Chinese and Korean women who were forced into sexual slavery in Japanese military brothels. Beginning in 1972, a series of Japanese prime ministers have issued official apologies of varying language, mostly expressing the general remorse of the nation rather than an outright apology for any specific events. As recently as 2018, the Japanese government has officially acknowledged that the Imperial Japanese Army killed a large number of non-combatants and committed lighter criminal acts. These apologies invariably avoid acknowledging the most depraved acts of rape, mutilation, arson, and the various brutal punishments imposed on the civilian population. It is important to note that Japan's acknowledgement of their responsibility for such atrocities is intrinsically linked to acceptance of their larger role in the war and the terms of their surrender in World War II. If they accept responsibility for the massacre, then they implicitly validate the position of the Allied nations and the actions taken against Japan after the war. Outside of the diplomatic arena, the Chinese and Japanese have never agreed on the extent of the atrocities, especially with respect to the number of Chinese people killed. The Chinese have consistently accused the Japanese of minimizing the severity of their crimes through claims of fewer civilian deaths, while the Japanese have accused the Chinese of inflating these figures to artificially increase the magnitude of Japanese war crimes. There is some evidence to support that the Chinese, and especially their communist regimes, have promoted nationalist support by portraying Japan as a common enemy to the Chinese people. And likewise, the Japanese can use opposing claims to reduce the perception of culpability among their own people. Meanwhile, there are documented cases of school textbook revisions to reduce the magnitude of atrocities attributed to the Nanking massacre or even to omit it entirely. One account describes a pattern of middle school curriculum whereby students are left to read a textbook chapter as an optional exercise, with the justification that the ancient history of Japanese civilization occupies too much of the available time to fit this important period of Japanese history into the course. Indeed, many younger Japanese citizens today exhibit little knowledge of the massacre. At the more extreme right-wing end of Japanese political spectrum, there are those who claim that the Nanking massacre never even occurred, that it was a fabrication by the Chinese for propaganda purposes. Such revisionist historical accounts are used by the ultra-nationalist factions to garner support within their political base, with so-called historians producing questionable research to support their claims. The rape of Nanking was a terrifying expression of the worst of humanity, but it had many contributing factors beyond being a simple consequence of the Battle of Nanking. Japanese imperial expansionism, cultural distinctions between the Chinese and Japanese, and of course the resistance the Chinese put up to the Japanese military were all relevant. It is impossible to know the actual cost of the massacre in human lives, but its scale unquestionably makes it one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. It was a true crime against humanity. And yet, despite the grave nature of the massacre, human decency could be found in places like the International Committee of the Nanking Safety Zone, and foreign citizens like John Rabe and John McGee. Ultimately, the Japanese military escaped largely unpunished for the atrocities. Only a handful of lower-ranking officers and one general actually faced trial for what had happened. And in the end, the legacy of the Nanking massacre persists to this day in the social and political tensions between Japan and its former imperial victims, namely China and South Korea.